Let's see, where am I? Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Dr. Markman. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. How about you?
Good, thanks.
I mean, I was intimidated before you got on, but now considering the jacket that you're wearing, I don't even know if I deserve to be on this Zoom call. Holy cow, you look
Yeah,
sharp.
looking sharp. By the way, Dr. Markman, I just want to apologize for the Zoom links. Our audience knows I'm the funny one, not the smart one, so I messed up those Zoom links repeatedly. So thank you for being patient with us.
No worries. I'm not allowed to put anything on my calendar.
Oh, well, thanks to Bree then. She did a great job.
Yeah. No, she's great. If I put stuff on my calendar, I invariably mess it up. So I'm legally barred. There's actually an act of Congress now that prevents me from putting stuff on the calendar.
Well, Mr. or Dr. Markman, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We truly appreciate it, and we appreciate you. I'll just kind of give you a backdrop of where your name kind of came across our desk. So a couple episodes ago, we interviewed John Almarode. And he spoke highly of you, and he kind of walked through a little bit of your smart thinking process. And Casey and I, we don't do smart thinking, but we like to chat with people who do. And so we'd love to reach out to you. And so thank you for making the time. You've said a phrase, and I've noticed that you've said it for almost 10 years or more. And your phrase is, most of us are asked to think for a living, and yet very few of us are taught much about the way our minds work. I love that phrase, and then I've noticed that you've kind of put a little bit of comedic twist to it recently, which is almost everyone you know has a mind, and I love that. That not everybody's thinking. We all might have a mind, but we're not always thinking. So, can you just expound upon that a little bit? Because especially in the world of education, not only are we dealing with our own minds, we're trying to deal with other people and give them thoughts and give them thinking strategies and dealing with their minds. So, talk to me a little bit more just about that concept.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about being human is that we don't come programmed with much.
Hmm.
So we have to learn
Hmm.
almost everything from somebody else. I mean, unlike a deer that's really well adapted to running away from predators and finding food in forests and things like that, um, but is really bad at urban environments, for example. So we have deer all over Austin. They are bad at roads. They're bad at iPads. They're bad at supermarkets. Um, Humans, we're not adapted to particular environments. What we are adapted for is we're really good at learning from each other.
Hmm.
And and that learning, as educators, right? There's knowledge, there's skills, there's attitudes. And we have to learn all of those. So we have to learn what is there in the world? What are the concepts? What are the objects? What's out there? But we also have to learn skills. And some of those skills are physical skills. So, I mean, our evolutionary environment didn't have saxophones in it, but we have great sax players in the world because they are able to then adapt themselves to this tool that's been created that allows people to make music. So we have physical skills like that, but we have mental skills too. And if you think about a lot of what education is about, it's fundamentally about trying to teach people to create better thinking skills, more, to really be more systematic in the way that we're thinking about things, to overcome the bias to just accept something that sounds reasonable because it conforms to what we already believe, and to be skeptical about those things and to generate alternative explanations. All of those kinds of things are skills, thinking skills. And then there are attitudes behind those, right? Which is, I should be skeptical of things. I should be willing to take a stance of questioning not just things that I disagree with on the surface, but even some things that sound totally plausible, but still require digging in a little.
So
You
I,
said
I
something.
have,
Go ahead.
yeah, here we go. We've had a third person, so our timing's going to be off on this. My question is, how do we get, because we're not cognitive scientists. So, how do we make this accessible to our teachers so that they can then begin to implement these strategies with our students?
Yeah, I think step one is just adding more understanding of human psychology into the way that we train anyone who's going to teach. Because I think there are certain things that the mind does that are pretty intuitive, but then there are times where there's the way we think is a little bit more counterintuitive. And so the more that's why I say the more that you understand about the way the mind works, the more effective you can be at using your own mind, but also at training other people to use theirs, leading people through that process. And so, I mean, so for example, take a concept like the illusion of explanatory depth, which which I talk about a little bit in Smart Thinking, which is this idea that we believe we understand the world better than we actually understand it. And that's something that after you point it out to people, they're like, yeah, I've had that happen to me, but it's not obvious in advance. And so that's why a lot of times as instructors, we stand up in front of a room and we give a really brilliant explanation of something because we're good explainers. And then everybody else nods along and goes, oh yeah, yeah, I get it. I get it. But what we don't do is force them to then explain it back to make sure they understand it. And so part of that illusion of explanatory depth is if I hear somebody else really smart say a really smart thing and I follow along with it in the moment, I think, oh, good, I get it. No, they get it. And you were able to follow along with them in that moment. Whether you get it or not depends a little bit on whether you can actually get your way back through that explanation all by yourself. And that's a wholly different skill.
Yeah, I've heard you mention this, the illusion of explanatory depth before, and it's a very complicated phrase to just say we don't know what we don't know, right? But we think we know what we don't know. And correct, right? Like
Yeah,
we think we have a
it's correct, but the reason why we use the really long phrase is because there's something really special about explanations compared to other knowledge. We're really good at lots of other things. If I ask you, do you know the plot of Finding Nemo? If you say yes, you know it. And if you say no, you don't know it. And if you say I kind of sort of know it, then you can get sort of some way through. And so, complicated things like plots of movies and stories, basic facts, do you know the address of the White House? If you say yes, you know it. If you say no, you don't know it. If you say kind of, means you sort of know it, but maybe you don't know the zip code or something. So it's there's something about explanation, about causal understanding that's actually that almost uniquely creates this kind of illusion. So I
well,
just
we
yeah.
we actually, you hear it as a pass quite often when people say like, I know it, I'm just having a hard time explaining it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
I just can't.
Right.
And they want to say, well, then you don't know it, because if you
Right.
can't explain it, then you don't know it. And that's part of the
Usually
struggle
students
that
are
we
saying
have.
that when they're looking for a better grade. Like, I
Yes,
know it. I
exactly
just
right.
couldn't say it on the exam. Yeah. But
Yes.
that would have been the time to say it.
Right. Yeah. An opportune time to say it. Yeah. But that explains some of the complexity that we have in schools, is because there is this very real event that I know it. I have it in my brain. And if I were to sit with you with a cup of coffee, we could talk about it and I could work myself around it and I can ask good questions. But now I'm sitting there in an exam and the environment around me is causing some distractions, or the anxiety of a test is causing some disruptions. And so we don't do a great job of explaining it. And so I think that can actually kind of move us into your book, Smart Thinking, because as I kind of walk through it and I walk through your three components, they're pretty simple. And on the surface level, you can almost be like, yeah, okay. But as you really dive into it, you're like, no, there's a lot of nuance, there's a ton of depth, and we can get lost in it pretty quick.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to just say them, the three, and then we'll walk into them. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And I think I'm kind of rephrase them. So tell me if I'm off. But number one is develop smart habits.
Yep.
Which could be, is it heuristic habits, right? That's the same thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, but also just habits, right? I mean, like, habits are just routines that you have that you don't have to think about doing. And some number of your habits can be really, and most of your habits actually are really helpful to you. And there are lots of thinking habits that can be really helpful.
Well, what I love about smart habits is because I can right now tell you I have some habits that are not smart and they're not helpful. Right. So one of them being I have these note cards on my desk. And so whenever I have a thought or a phone call or I'm talking to a student, I'll write it on the note card. That's not a smart habit because I inevitably lose that note card. Right. If I were to write it in a journal, I'd be better. So we have habits that aren't always smart. Again, I'm just going to walk through these and then we'll dive
Yeah.
deeply. The second component is acquire high quality knowledge or just simply know a lot of stuff, right?
Yep.
Right. Which again, on the surface is a no-brainer, but I think you do a great job of diving deep into it. And then the third one is being able to use that knowledge in multiple settings, being able to draw upon it, and especially that component of taking something that is in an unlike field and applying it to a new situation, right? Being able to do that.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Okay, so let's dive into developing smart habits.
Yeah.
I'll let you just kind of walk into that, and then Casey and I will ask some questions around it. So talk to me more about developing smart habits.
Yeah, and before I do that, I just want to say, right, your reaction, your initial reaction of, yeah, this stuff seems obvious at first. Totally. In fact, when I was writing this book, the first several publishers all went, doesn't everybody already know this stuff? I was like, clearly not, because they're not doing it.
Right.
Right. So it may seem obvious, but if everyone were doing it, wouldn't need the book.
Correct.
And it's in fact why in the front end of the book there's a little quiz of behaviors so that people can look at them and go, oh yeah, I'm not, should I do that? Should I not do that? I'm actually not sure. So as soon as you say I'm not sure, it means no, it wasn't as intuitive as
Sure.
you thought.
Good.
Okay. So smart habits. Look, habits are interesting things. Habits are basically memories of what you're supposed to do in particular situations. When you're faster to remember what you're supposed to do than to think about what you're supposed to do, that's when you have a habit. They're great and they drive a huge amount of our behavior. And that's true in the physical environment. So, you probably have habits to flip on the light switch of your bedroom, which is, you don't want to have to think about doing that. So you just walk in the bedroom and your hand reaches out to the right place and flips on the switch. But we also have a lot of thinking habits. And those thinking habits are going to influence how we navigate the world. So for example, think about education for a second. We create a curriculum, and that curriculum lays out all of this stuff that we want students to know, and students develop habits to say, okay, I've got to figure out what they really want me to know so that I can be successful in school. So they're throwing lots of information at me, and now what I'm trying to do is to figure out clues like, what are they going to test me on? And can I negotiate to make sure that this exam isn't cumulative so that I don't need to remember stuff from October in May? And so we're constantly we're developing these thinking habits to try to minimize how much stuff we actually learn, because we think as kids, as students, we think the game is to get an A. As opposed to the game is to know stuff and know how to do stuff. And so we develop a set of habits that are optimized for the school environment, but not necessarily so good for being effective in the world after you get out of school. So there's a lot of habits we build. I mean, as educators, we try to create some habits. So we will build, if you're trying to teach somebody to write an essay, you might start with an outline and say, okay, I want you to build an outline. I want you to do this kind of research. I want you to structure it in this way, in the hope of building a set of habits around how you then construct an essay so that you don't have to keep thinking about how to do it. Those are great habits. Those are smart habits. But along the way, we also create all of these other subtle habits by virtue of the way we structure the education environment that are not always optimal. They're great for being a good student, but they're not necessarily great for being a good human after you get out of school.
So I have a question then, and it might help me frame this a little bit. So I was teaching a class on 6 forms of engagement that Brian and I have been working on. And one of the things that I told that class yesterday was, one of the things that we need to do in order to get kids to be engaged behaviorally is that we have to have routines in place in our classroom. And is this does this line up with what smart thinking tells us to do? Or these smart habits is creating these routines? And probably the answer is it depends what those routines are, right? So if that's the case, what are some of the routines that we should implement that would get our students to have these smart habits?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we're trying to do is to think about how can we create really good independent thinkers. So part of what we want to do is to figure out how do we align habits with things we'd like to see our students do, even if we're not in the room. I mean, there's a certain amount of stuff that's classroom management, so I've got to get everybody ready to, they've been milling around outside. Now we got to get them calmed down. So we're going to develop some routines around that. That's great, but that's more about those group dynamics. And they're important for the education environment. But a lot of the really effective habits are the ones where we're thinking about, okay, how can we build a set of habits that will serve our students not just in the classroom but beyond? So, by giving them habits around where they should put their cell phone, for example, so that it's, or other devices. By giving them habits around, having a book, like an actual physical book somewhere nearby, so that if they have a few extra minutes, they could pick it up and read it. I mean, there's lots of things that we can do, giving students habits like asking why a lot, you know.
Hmm.
So a lot of times we particularly early on when you're learning some brand new thing, you're learning for information. So somebody says something and then you're like, wow, that's really fascinating. But what you need to be doing is not just hearing some knowledge, but really pushing a little bit. Like, why is that? Let's dig in, and that's sort of, those questions that can then bootstrap you into curiosity, basically, right? Is from the outside in, right? A lot of times we think, well, we got to teach curiosity, right? We got to make people want knowledge. Okay, but part of the way you can do that is doing it from the outside in. If I get you to ask why a lot of times the answer to that question turns out to be really interesting. And so eventually, by practicing just asking somebody who seems to know some stuff, asking them why, practicing that then makes you more curious, because suddenly you realize, wow, every time I dig into something, I learn some really cool thing, or I get into some really cool conversation, and then I become a curious person rather than the other way around.
Why
Teaching the
is
habit of curiosity.
Yeah.
and isn't that, I think figuring out the cause is largely how we do that, right? But what makes the cause of things so interesting?
So causes are cool because they are what allow us to intervene on the world. So I tell this story all the time about when I was a kid, back in the 70s. I'd go to visit my grandparents, and grandparents were legally obliged in that era to have plastic on their sofas. So I'd sit on the sofa with my grandfather, and I'd be sticking to it a little bit because the plastic, and we'd be watching this big old console TV that my grandfather had, and every once in a while the picture would go a little sideways and start, moving up, and he would just hoist himself off the couch and whack the console on the side, and then the picture would stabilize. I'd be like, Grandpa, why are you doing that? And he'd be like, I don't know. Sometimes that works. And so that's not a causal understanding of anything in the TV. That's just a procedure. And in the absence of understanding the way the world works, right, all you have are procedures. And by the way, if you think, well,
Mm.
that's just a goofy thing to do, remember, every time your computer doesn't do what it's supposed to do, you just reboot it, which is the 21st century equivalent of whacking a TV on the side.
But
But
darn it, it works almost every time.
most of the time, right, right. But if it doesn't work, you got to call IT.
Yep.
And so in the absence of understanding the way the world works, you need you need just processes. But if you actually get how the world works, now you can actually find clever ways to intervene and think, okay, because this causes that, if I make some change in the underlying cause, I can create a different outcome.
So that is brilliant thinking, and I will probably use, especially with Casey, who loves procedures and things like that. That I'll use this. That's just because you don't understand, Casey.
Right.
Um, uh,
Exactly.
but I'm thinking of an elementary level. I'm thinking of my own children, who they develop habits pretty quickly, most of which are irritants and wrong, right?
Sure.
Because their understanding of the world is radically limited, and so they're going to make decisions and build habits based on what they know.
Right.
And I'm also considering this idea of behavior mapping. You say quite often that your behavior is is a reaction to your environment, right? Or your habit is going to be a reaction to your environment.
Right.
That's how you build your habits. In an elementary school, we are teaching them good habits, right? Have a book at nearby, how to write, how to zip up your jacket when you go outside. We're trying to build those habits. And it works because they have this roughly the same teacher in the same environment almost all day long. They go
Yep.
from school to home. Once they get into middle school, and that can be sixth grade, seventh grade, they're still fairly young in their thinking, very small understanding of the world. And now they have six, seven, eight teachers, all of whom are trying to give them their techniques that they've learned over a lifetime. Here's how you organize your binder. Here's how you take notes. Does that create a lot of dysfunction in a young mind where now they have to navigate these different sort of habits depending on the teacher? Or is that a good process for them to start training their brain of, okay, I have all these things coming after me. How do I create a larger habit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit overwhelming, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why, first of all, we wait until early adolescence to do it because we need a little bit of maturity. And not every kid thrives at the start of middle school. So it takes some kids a little bit longer to figure out how to navigate that situation. I mean, kids are very adaptable. I mean, it's not just home and school and home and school. They're also going to karate and ballet and whatever. And so they're learning all sorts of things in those environments as well. Where they're taking place over, they have longer chunks of time associated with it. They're getting 6 hours in school, and then they're getting an hour in ballet, and then they're getting, 45 minutes in piano lessons or whatever. So it's a little bit slower when they're in elementary school. And then we throw them into the pond and we say, okay, every 45 minutes we're going to shuffle up your environment. Which, it's good preparation. I mean, now, like my day today, I mean, we're hanging out. I'm gonna bolt to a meeting right after this, and then another meeting. And my environment's going to change every half hour or 40 minutes for until the end of the workday. So at some point we got to learn to adapt to it.
Sure.
I think it's okay. I just think we need to be understanding about the very first time that you're thrust into this ever-changing environment, exactly how overwhelming that's going to be. And then not everybody's going to thrive in that.
Especially if they don't have the skills to navigate it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Brian, I know you want to lead us through more of the book, but I have a quick question. Is there something that a school could do to create, talking specifically about secondary schools where kids are moving from class to class, to create a smarter culture to support the students in the course of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest thing you can do is to just have a little bit more coordination, particularly in that first year transition from one environment into the next, of saying, all right, look, all of us have our favorite way of trying to organize stuff, but there are some decisions that are discipline specific and important, and some of them that are individual preference it doesn't really matter. I could do it a different way. I think if you were to get a team together and say, hey, look, which of the habits that I'm trying to create do I not really care that much about? I mean, how you organize your binder, there's probably 12 ways to do it.
Yep.
Let's just pick one and make sure that the students are hearing the same thing from everybody.
Yep.
And it may not be my favorite or your favorite, it's somebody else's favorite, but who cares, right? That's how.
Is it organized? That's what I want to know.
Right. Which organizational scheme doesn't matter as long as we pick one and let's be consistent about it. But then there might be things that are discipline specific. So some habits that I might want to instill if I'm teaching math versus science versus language arts, English, whatever. Then the discipline specific things, you can then say, okay, we're going to deviate from what I told you in this class. What you're doing, you're going to deviate a little bit because, like in math, I need you to use pencil in this class because,
a lot of errors
because you're going to make a lot of mistakes and your paper gets to be a mess in a hurry if you're using ink, and so there may be some things that are habits that are specific to a discipline, but you want those to be as few as possible, and for there to be a reasonably good purpose for doing that. I think, at least initially that's great. Eventually, by the time a kid's a junior in high school, it can be a free for all across the set of classes students are taking, because they've learned how to navigate that kind of rapidly changing environment. But if you're in sixth grade, let's keep as much consistent as possible, and then focus on, here are the important distinctions you need to be learning.
So I think some of these key phrases in your titles are important. So it's not just develop habits, but develop smart or purposeful habits, right? Like
Right,
we
right.
need to be careful on what we do. So the next one then is I can reduce the title to know a lot of stuff, but you do have this phrase, or at least I think the phrase is there, of acquire high quality knowledge.
That's right.
There's that modifier. So can you define what does that mean by high quality knowledge?
Yeah, so high quality knowledge means, first of all, you want to learn things that are true, right? So you'd really like to vet the stuff that you're encountering. And of course, in the modern world, the internet being what it is, and now with generative AI being what it is, there can be a lot of information out there that you encounter, but it's not actually true. So I think first things first, getting good sources, and eventually learning to be more skeptical, but initially really just trying to surround yourself with good information. That's important. And then the other is, again, we talked a little bit about this illusion of explanatory depth. Part of what you want is to know what you know and know what you don't know. And so, you know, creating that habit of explaining stuff back to yourself to make sure you understand it is really important, because this way you are well calibrated about, okay, I do really understand how this works, or I only partially understand how this works, and I should learn more about it. Or, by the time you're an adult, you may even say, like, I don't have any earthly idea how my car works. And I'm fine with that. It's okay. I mean, when I go buy a car and the car dealer like flips the hood open and I have to stand there nodding sagely, right? I'm like, wires, metal, bet it's an engine, you know. But I'm okay with that, because I know I can get somebody else to fix that for me.
Yeah.
But I'm calibrated on that, and that's important. Knowing that there's a set of things I know and don't know.
Would it be fair then, in case I know you're getting itchy over there, would it be fair then to connecting this back with developing purposeful or smart habits in a world of education where we have AI, we have the Google, we have all of those things? It's easy for us to say, why are we teaching all this knowledge when you can acquire it anywhere? So at your fingertips. So let's focus on the habit of asking good questions then, right? So if
Yeah.
I have that, like you said, curiosity, asking why, we need to constantly be reinforcing with our teachers, with our students, with our community. Don't just take what I'm saying, ask quality questions, because that's going to allow you to develop a higher knowledge base of important stuff, or even just to your point earlier, assess if it's true or not.
Yeah. I I mean, I certainly think that set of skills is really important, but I also think people need to cram a lot of knowledge into their heads. So one of the things that people often say is, well, I don't need to know. It's on the internet. I could look it up if I need it. The problem is, how are you going to know if you needed it if you don't know it? Like, if you're blissfully unaware of the existence of something, you're not even going to know you're supposed to ask the question.
Yeah.
So, I think the other piece to this is, we need to know way more than we think we need to know. And this is part of where those habits come in. All of us, I mean, I get this at the college level. Students who make it to college are good at school, particularly, they get to a place like University of Texas. That's pretty elite place. These are people who've mastered school. So they have mastered the art of figuring out which little bits of stuff inside of the massive amount of information being thrown at them is the stuff that's actually going to be tested, that enabled them to get really good grades. Problem is, after you get out of college, nobody cares what's on your transcript. So your grades never mattered. It's what you know and what you're able to bring to bear in the moment. You can't be sitting there in a meeting and saying, "Wait, quick, let me Google that," while the president of the company is sitting there. You got to know it in that moment. If you're going to shine, it's not going to be, let me check on my device. It's going to be, I can spout this thing off. So you need to know a ton and more than you think you need to know. And so what happens is by the time they get to college, they ask my least favorite question, right? Is this going to be on the exam? And what is this going to be on the exam signals is you're telling me tons of stuff, but really you only care about a little of it. So just clue me in as to what that little bit is so I can be as efficient as possible in what I'm going to learn. And that's wrong. Don't be efficient. Be really inefficient. Learn way too much stuff because only later in your life will you realize, oh, I'm glad I learned that because it turns out to have been important. And I literally do this, and everyone is free to steal this. But I tell students all the time, if you come to me and say, is this going to be on the exam? My answer is going to be yes, but it might not be my exam.
I think that's great. And one of the things I remember most when I went to college was making those connections because I was starting to keep the information and suddenly there were connections between classes that I had never made before in life.
Right.
I want to ask a slightly different question. I know it's not quite on this point of smart habits, but we keep bringing up the illusion of explanatory depth. And as I talk to my teachers, one of the things that we're talking about is we want to work on pro-social behaviors. And we always talk about it when we're thinking about behaving, getting along in this era where students are increasingly isolated because they have their device and their iPad and they're not just out playing. But as we talk here, I'm starting to realize that I think this is how we demonstrate our learning. Is learning actually, do we know if learning has occurred until it has been socialized, until it has been discussed with someone else? I mean, is that a fair statement?
I mean, we have to engage in something that feels like a social behavior. Sometimes we write it down and we're the only one who reads it. But why do you write stuff? Generally speaking, you write stuff because you're expecting somebody else to read it. So, and in fact, I mean, so Vygotsky, who was a Russian psychologist in the 20s, who was very much about the importance of the social environment in learning, he said thought is inner speech. And I want you to think about what that really means. What is speech? Speech is an action we perform in order to communicate something with somebody else. And so this idea that thinking is really just internalizing a social act says I don't necessarily need to be in a social environment to learn something, but I'm going to engage in all the behaviors I would engage in a social environment in order to think, in order to know stuff. And I might end up in an environment in which I do it all alone, but really that's because we are a social species. It's, most of us can't accomplish much alone. We really, humans dominate planet Earth. We're not particularly fearsome physical creatures. I mean, you take a Chicago bear and put them up against an actual bear, and the actual bear wins every time.
You could put a Chicago bear up against anything and it will lose. Okay.
Well, that's true. True enough. True enough. But, but we dominate the planet because we work together so well. And so that coordination, that ability to share knowledge, to use knowledge in social settings is absolutely critical to what we do.
Can I ask a quick question? And then I want to get back to the third component here. As I was considering this, acquire high quality knowledge, and especially the educational world in the last, let's say, 10 years, if not for sure the last 5 years, we have, and I think this is true, began to really applaud and reward high level thinking skills.
Yeah.
Which means rote memorization isn't all that important. If you can just tell me what I said yesterday, if you can just recite the thing that we talked about yesterday, that's not knowledge. And we kind of keep hammering that out. However, what you're implying is you have to have a ton of rote memorization in your brain so that you can use it. Like you need to be able to recall it quickly. So have we in our current culture of education, have we gone too far? Have we tossed out the baby with the bathwater and said we've kind of gotten away from the rote memorization too much?
There's a pendulum that swings in the arc of education. I mean, go back to the early 1960s in the new math, right? What was the new math? The new math back in the 60s was, we don't need all that drill and kill on math facts. We just want to teach you the concepts underlying mathematics. And so what we ended up with was 5 years worth of students who couldn't do math because it turns out actually you also need to know your basic math facts in order to be able to do anything more sophisticated. And so, I do think that pendulum swings. And I think that emphasizing high level thinking skills is really important. I joked that for a long time the fundamental problem with public education was we aimed to create bright creative thinkers by making sure that everyone got the same answer on the state test. But I think that what we need to do is to think about how do we create that full balance. And that's what I was talking about earlier about really understanding the way minds work. So yes, we need to develop those skills to think critically, to ask questions, to be, to ask why so that we're curious. But we have to do that in the context of knowing a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So because, the other thing is think about, an example I use a lot is if you're a soccer fan and you go to a game, you can regale somebody later with a whole discussion of what happened in the game and the sophisticated offense and defense that the teams were playing and stuff like that. And if you don't know anything about soccer, you saw a bunch of people run haphazardly around a field, and every once in a while somebody fell down and clutched their ankle until nobody was looking, right? And so your experience of the world depends on how much you already know.
Yeah.
And so if you don't build a great knowledge base, you don't even see stuff in the world that other people are seeing.
Yeah. And I want to point out the reason why I love your book and this thought process is because it is radically simple on the surface, but because you have spent a lifetime understanding the way we think, you've wrapped it together in a holistic way. Because if I just stopped with developing habits, that's not good enough. If I just stop with, okay, now I have good habits and I'm acquiring a ton of knowledge, that's not good enough. I
Right.
need that third component, which is how can you take your habits, which allowed you to acquire a ton of knowledge that might seem useless at the time, and now we're going to say smart thinking is taking knowledge and applying it in a variety of other contexts.
Yep.
And that is the crucial, I'm assuming that's the antithesis of what you're trying to get to, correct?
Yeah. No, that's it, right? You at the end of the day, the knowledge is only helpful because you can use it. And
Correct.
and this is another place where you got to understand how minds work. And so here's I'm gonna do a little quick demonstration for everybody. Okay. I want anyone listening, think about a birthday party you attended.
You've got about 5 people thinking about that, so that's awesome.
Right. Okay. That's cool. Hey, whatever it takes, man. One at a time. So we got so think about a birthday party. Now you're not expecting me to talk about a birthday party. I mentioned a birthday party and suddenly your mind just goes wham. Okay, I'm handing that to you without any effort. That's what brains do is they serve up information in response to a query, in response to information in the environment. It serves stuff up. So that's part one. Okay, is brains are really good at serving up information that seems relevant to what's going on. Now here this is the essence of creativity. Nobody believes this, but this is the essence of creativity right here. So I just asked you to think of a birthday party. If you thought of a birthday party that was a party for a kid, now I want you to think about a party that was a party for an adult. And if you happen to think about a party that was a party for an adult, I want you to think about a party that was a party for a kid. Now, just asking you to do that, you immediately do it. So if you had been thinking pointy hats and presents, and now you're thinking about, martinis and whatever your favorite, adult birthday party is. So just that little change in the question completely changed the information that came out. Now you're thinking, duh, but what does this mean? It means the essence of creativity is change the question you're asking and different information comes up.
Do you mind if I piggyback off of that? Because
yeah,
you are hitting on, I'm assuming you've come across the work by David Epstein, and it's called Range. Have you ever read that book?
Yeah.
A teacher of mine is currently reading this, and so he came down.
I've been writing about that stuff for 20 years.
Yeah, and
I love
he's
the book
loving this.
because I'm glad it's popularized it, right? It's awesome. Yeah.
Yes, and so I'm just for our readers, for you and me, because he's hitting exactly what you're saying, which is in order for us to think and to solve complex problems, we have to think in metaphors or in analogies outside of our fields. And so he gives all these examples of people who, like, I'll just kind of briefly go over one. There was this Dr. Paul Barron who was tasked with designing a resilient communication system for the military, right?
Yep.
Resilient communication for the military. So you would think he would spend his time in technology and in military thinking, but in order to solve this problem in a brilliant way, he thought in biology, and he used his knowledge of the human body and how our nervous system works. And that if one component shuts down, your whole body doesn't shut down. Your body creates different pathways or uses different pathways. And so that's how he created it's called the packet switching. And it's now what we use in modern internet, which is we're going to have all these different systems communicating so that if one breaks down, the whole system doesn't shut down.
Right.
And that's what you're talking about. Because if you have a ton of knowledge in a bunch of different areas and you train your mind to ask slightly different questions, you're going to
Yep.
start thinking about other things and now you're going to integrate them together.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah. And in fact, so I've called that, I've been writing about this for a long time as well. I call the people who are really good at that expert generalists.
Yes.
They're people who know a ton about a lot of different things. And then what they're really good at is having those conversations with you and recognizing, oh, the thing you're talking about, they've also done this in these four other places.
Yeah.
They are people who have kind of internalized everything that I talk about in smart thinking is I get really curious about things. I learn a ton. I eliminate that illusion of explanatory depth, and then I get really good at describing problems so that it leads me to think about all this other stuff that I know that then causes me to come at these different angles at problems that are different, that are angles that are different from what everybody else is choosing, because I have this other range of knowledge that everybody else trying to solve the problem doesn't have. Yeah,
So
100%. I love the fact that range is making that idea more accessible for everybody. I think it's great.
I know, Dr. Markman, that you have something going on here soon. So, Casey, I'm going to have you ask a question, and then we're going to try and wrap this thing up here shortly.
Actually, I was just going to give you the heads up that we probably got to let him go, and it might be time for our wrap up.
Okay, so then I have a question, and then Casey and I, we do have a little process of wrapping up here. Dr. Markman, I've noticed as you're chatting that you have some Star Wars paraphernalia around you. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm going to give you time to think of it as Casey and I wrap it up. So, considering your process of smart thinking, right, especially the component of taking unlike things and comparing it to something else and finding a truth, my question to you is, using your what seems to be knowledge and passion for Star Wars, what can we as educators learn? And it can be in all of your knowledge, either from the movies, from the historical creation of it, whatever it might be. I'm going to let you go, but I'm going to ask you to connect Star Wars and what we as educators can learn. Now,
Yeah.
I'm going to give you time to think. Casey, wrap this sucker up. What's the takeaway of the episode?
So I have a whole bunch, pages of notes, but let me give you two things. First of all, I love the simplicity of change the question, and that's going to change the thinking. I think that's great, and I think that's something all of us can remember and put into action. The other thing I appreciated was you helping me update my knowledge, because I was thinking about true learning occurs when we're able to socialize that understanding and share it out. But you made it clear too that some of that does happen internally. Now, I think a teacher probably has to ask the kid to say it out loud to someone, because that's the only way we're going to be able to access the thoughts. But I appreciated that update, because learning might be occurring and it is sort of a social act, but it's a conversation with yourself a lot of times. So I appreciated those things.
I as well. I wrote those as well, so you kind of stole my thunder. One of the things or two of the things that I appreciated was the constant reminder or call to us is, how do we create independent thinkers? We say that we like that and we say that we want that, but oftentimes when it manifests itself in the classroom, it becomes problematic and it becomes frustrating because we think that they're being aggressive or stop asking why, just do what I asked you to do, right? And so teaching and kind of modeling that and allowing that. And then I do really appreciate in the absence of understanding, we have procedures. Education can oftentimes fall victim to the habit of procedures. And so not being able to understand why we're doing it, we just like the safety of the procedure, figuring out different ways to challenge that and to work through that. So thank you, Dr. Markman, for that. All right. We're all
All right.
excited to hear how Star Wars can change the educational world.
Well, I think the fundamental thing about Star Wars is, why was it so successful? It was successful because what it did was it took stories that we're familiar with, and then so it brought analogies to Westerns and to all these other kinds of genres, and then put it into a genre that most people were not comfortable with. If you look at a lot of science fiction, up to science fiction movies up to the 70s, you had things like 2001: A Space Odyssey, where brilliant movie, but the last 20 minutes, nobody knows what's going on. And so many of the stories failed to capture people because they were just so out there. And the reason that Star Wars appealed to so many people was it said, you can change the trappings of the environment, but fundamentally the stories are still the same.
The hero's journey, right?
Yeah. And so that ability, I think, to draw on a vast knowledge base, and then and turn that into something that's both novel and accessible, is I think, one of the things that makes almost anybody successful.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for, man, and you're modeling your own smart thinking. So thank you for doing
Appreciate
that. Dr. Markman, I know you're busy. You are the provost of a fantastic, brilliant school. So the amount of responsibilities that you have on any given day, Casey and I can only shrink from. So we appreciate you taking the time on an early Friday morning to hang out with us. So thank you so much. Good luck to you. And truly, truly, thank you for what you do in the world of education and for the minds of people growing up. Thank you.
Appreciate that.